This is the bottom of it, basically, is every business in the world is accountable to their profit and loss, right? If you are not profitably solving customer problems, then you go out of business, and whatever capital is in that business gets absorbed into some other profitable business and put to a higher and better use. And it is that kind of Darwinian pressure that drives, this is economic competition, that drives human progress, innovation, make sure that we're efficiently allocating capital in a way that satisfies the most human wants possible. So that is the profit and loss motive, right? That keeps businesses honest. Well, if you give a business a money printer, it doesn't care about generating losses anymore, right? And inside of government, they call these deficits,
right?
But it's the same thing. It's a loss. And when that business can just print money to paper over these deficits or losses, it destroys capital formation, right? You're not actually solving problems that people want solved. You're solving problems that the bureaucrats privately want solved for themselves at the expense of everyone else.
It's interesting because I mentioned that I don't do a ton of economics on the show, but when I'm asked about it, the two things that I always bring up are the price of food at the grocery. Like that's one indicator of things. And right now it's just very high. We know that. Pound of beef, dozen eggs, just way higher than it was, say, 2-3 years ago. That and interest rates to me, because when interest rates are low and you have a chance of buying a house, at a low interest rate, I like paying. I was locked in at a low interest rate, fortunately here. I like paying my mortgage every month because I'm like, oh, I'm basically paying myself and my house will increase in value and over time. And to me, is that like a fair indicator of what's kind of wrong with economics right now? And then I also want to talk about the debt, but like those two specifically.
Yeah, well, this is how deep this problem is. Interest rates, right? We've been conditioned into the reality that they are centrally planned, right? This is a price, right? In Soviet Russia, they used to try to plan all the prices, right? And that was a disaster. They ended up having to emulate the US because it's a data throughput problem. You just can't price things centrally, right? You need the market to determine them, and you need the market to clear where supply meets demand, basically. Well, the market for money is...
Or you got to kill a lot of people, basically.
Or you got to kill a lot of people,
yeah. To get them to operate in those conditions. I mean, truly.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And the market for money is one of the largest and most important markets in the world. And by way of rough analogy, the interest rate is the price of money. Now, that's not exactly right, because there's technically an interest rate for every form of capital. It's a quantification of time preference. But to be simple, the interest rate is where supply and demand of loanable funds cross, right? There's a market interest rate. People want to borrow and people want to lend. And wherever that interest rate is, and there's different interest rates for different intervals, right? 3 month, 12 months, 24 month, et cetera. That should be a market phenomenon. That should just be freely determined by supply and demand. We should be looking at that on an exchange every day and say, what is the interest rate today? And it should be between private borrowers and private lenders, right? So yet we live in this world where that whole price is centrally determined and centrally managed. Again, this is one of those policy tools that the central bank uses to manage the economy. But the reality is, the government is one of the largest debtors in the world. I think it is actually the largest debtor, if I'm not mistaken.
I couldn't run my business like the way they're running this thing.
Oh, that's because you don't have a money printer. Yeah. But if you had a money printer, you could.
Working on it.
And this is the bottom of it, basically, is every business in the world is accountable to their profit and loss, right? If you are not profitably solving customer problems, then you go out of business, and whatever capital is in that business gets absorbed into some other profitable business and put to a higher and better use. And it is that kind of Darwinian pressure that drives, this is economic competition, that drives human progress, innovation, make sure that we're efficiently allocating capital in a way that satisfies the most human wants possible. So that is the profit and loss motive, right? That keeps businesses honest. Well, if you give a business a money printer, it doesn't care about generating losses anymore, right? And inside of government, they call these deficits,
right?
But it's the same thing. It's a loss. And when that business can just print money to paper over these deficits or losses, it destroys capital formation, right? You're not actually solving problems that people want solved. You're solving problems that the bureaucrats privately want solved for themselves at the expense of everyone else.
So when you see something like, these bank bailouts, or when Silicon Valley Bank went down and it turned out that they didn't even have like a chief lending officer, but they had a huge DEI department instead to figure out the color of the skin of the people lending the money, but they didn't have someone actually doing the math on it. But then they get bailed out, and then they get, I was with First Republic and now it's part of Chase, and this happens over and over. That basically the banks can do all sorts of crazy things that are not responsible, but then they just get eaten alive so that too big to fail becomes much bigger, actually.
Yes. Heads I win, tails you lose, basically. Like they privatize gains over time, and if they ever have a loss event that's big enough, that gets socialized. Everyone pays for it via inflation.
So I know that ultimately your answer would be Bitcoin would be the way out of that.
Or we could also follow the U.S. Constitution. I mean, the U.S. resisted an implementation of central banking twice. It took 3 attempts to get the Federal Reserve in. And again, the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is great on this. It still took this very duplicitous kind of maneuver around the holidays, and it was just very shady, to say the least. If we could adhere to the U.S. Constitution, I don't think we'd have a central bank today. But given the nature of human greed and incentives and opportunism, we have one, and we've had one for 100 years, and it doesn't appear that there's any legislation that can take care of that at this point. Although legislation has been introduced. I think Massey introduced a bill to abolish the Fed. Mm-hmm. We'll see. But those power structures become pretty entrenched. And what's the old quote from Rothschild? That, give me a power to issue a nation's currency, I care not who makes its laws. When you can print money, you can pretty effectively guide the legal apparatus to your favor. Surprise, surprise. So yes, I view Bitcoin as a disruptor to gold, which is what the sovereignty of the central bank is really based on. Central banks hold about 25% of the global gold supply.
So what would you say to someone who sort of new to this conversation, they're making a little bit of money, maybe they're not a total ANCAP or libertarian, but they're like, all right, I want to put some portion of my wealth into Bitcoin. Like, where do you see the percentages on that? What do you think like a sensible strategy would be?
Well, this, you have to be intimately knowledgeable about that individual's aims, income, all these things that I just don't know. So I always hesitate to be prescriptive. So give
like the most broad sense.
My number one piece of financial advice, I always say, this is not financial advice. Well, this is financial advice. Yeah. Study the nature of money. Study Bitcoin. Just study it. I'm not even telling you to buy it. Just study it and see where it takes you. Because ultimately, I think your portfolio construction should be a reflection of your actual convictions. If you own something that you don't understand, you're going to have a bad outcome. Mm-hmm. Even if you own an undervalued asset. If you don't understand it, the market's going to move against you one day. You're going to get emotional and you're going to sell it, right? Or vice versa. You're just going to have a bad outcome. So I think studying money and studying Bitcoin will get you out of the Keynesian economic nonsense. There's a reason economics is what they call it, the dismal science. Is that the term they use? Yeah. It's because it's bullshit. It's not true. Like it's this whole propagandistic nonsense to justify the government printing of money. And it has nothing to do with real economics whatsoever, right? Like, I'm not trying to brag here. I have a master's degree in accounting and finance. I didn't learn one stitch of Austrian economics. I learned a lot of Keynesian economics. And it doesn't make any sense. But when I got out of school and discovered Bitcoin and discovered Austrian economics, I found something that made sense. So that's what I would encourage people to do, is actually look into this. I really hesitate to give percentages because that's unique to each and every person.
Sure. So does that also show you how the educational layer is so connected to the political layer, in a sense, that the guys that are supposed to be learning economics to get out there and build economies that can scale and do great things are actually learning really only the systems that will just increase the monster, so to speak?
Yeah. Again, that meta fraud term comes to mind, right? Like, and there's a saying in Bitcoin, fix the money, fix the world. And so if you take the flip side of that, it's, well, we have broken money, and I would say that's the source of many of the world's problems today. again, when you have this central government that cannot lose, it cannot contract, right? There's examples, I think this was in Lebanon, where they had like the train authority was still active. I don't know if this is active today, but maybe this was 10, 20 years ago. And they hadn't had a track of train for like 30 or 40 years in the country. It's like one of those things where what's
California, where we both used to live, they were trying to build the railway from LA to basically to Napa, and it was going to go to Vegas. Yeah. And what is it? It's like 30 billion in, or it's maybe even more, 60 billion in, and I don't think any train. It's like, where the hell is the money?
San Francisco spent.
We did it here in Florida.
$20 million trying to open a public restroom.
Yeah,
it's like, I mean, the misallocation of capital is so astronomical inside of government that it's mind blowing. And if you just stop and think about it, this is very intuitive. Like, name one domain where government does anything effectively, right? Like, you've been to the DMV. If you've ever dealt with, God forbid, state-run healthcare. Banking, insurance, all the things that the state touches become very inefficient because there's broken incentives, right? They don't have an incentive to be accountable to the preferences of their customers because they're backed by a money printer, right? And if you're backed by a money printer, then all you want to do is keep the scam going, right? Just let me keep printing money, and to hell with how you feel about your customer satisfaction, because guess what? I don't have a P&L. If I had a P&L, I would care about what you think.
Right.
The customer's always right in a competitive business, but the customer's always wrong in a money printing business.
If you're looking for an unfiltered lens into the world of tomorrow, check out our tech playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist, all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.